The first thing I'm going to do is take you through the most important buttons on the camera body. The first is the shutter button, and this is a two-phase button, meaning that the button has two positions. The first is a halfway depression, and the second is a full depression, which will actually take the picture. You need to train your finger to feel the sensitivity between these two positions because sometimes we will want to focus and other times we will want it to actually take the shot. The second most important button is the main selection dial, and I also call this your primary selector. It is located behind the shutter button, and you will notice that it rotates to the left or right. The third most important selector is on the back of the camera. You can't miss it. It's a large wheel, and this is called the quick selection dial by Canon, but I call this the secondary selector for a very good reason, which I will show you later. It's easy to overlook that there are in fact three different controls here. On the very outside of the secondary selector is a rotating wheel that moves to the left and right. This is used to change exposure settings and is one of the camera's main controls. Just inside the rotating wheel is a directional pad. You can move it up, down, left, right, in each of the four diagonals. It works like a joystick in that it allows you to select menu items, view images, move the focus boxes directionally. It's very handy and it's also very easy to overlook. In the center of the secondary selector we have the set button, which will be used to select menu items. The next most important dial, I would say, is probably the mode dial, and this allows you to control which mode you are shooting in. The mode dial has a locking center button that we will need to push before rotating the dial, and this prevents us from accidentally bumping it. Out of all the buttons on the camera, you are going to use these four more than anything. I promise you that. Let's look at some of the other secondary camera buttons so you know what they are and what they do. Immediately behind and to the left of the shutter button is the autofocus area selection button, which I call the cluster selector. It allows us to determine how many of our focus squares we are using. If you were to grip your camera with your right hand and look next to where your pinky would rest, you would see the depth of field preview button. It is very easy to miss, and its function is to close the aperture blades down so we can see our depth of field in real time. If we look on the opposite side of the camera, on that side of the lens, if we look halfway down, there's going to be a large oval button, and that oval button is your lens release. We are going to press this button every time we remove a lens from our camera body. The button above the lens release is the force flash button. This button is useful if you ever wish to force your flash to fire. On the left-hand side of the camera, we have some rubber gaskets underneath which we would find our microphone and headphone jack, the wired remote input, the audio-video terminal, and the mini HDMI port. On the right-hand side of the camera, we have our SD memory card slot, beneath which we have our battery compartment. Just to the left of the viewfinder, we have the power switch, and just below the power switch, we have the menu and info buttons. The menu button is a very important button, and we are going to be using it often. It is going to allow us to access the menu of the camera and tweak its settings. I have a whole portion of this video dedicated to the menu, and I've also set up a very special menu on the DVD as a way to quickly access any item we want to know about. It's going to save you a lot of time, and it is a fantastic reference tool. Push the info button repeatedly to cycle through different types of shooting, live view, and playback information. I use it most when inspecting images to check the histograms or other critical shooting data. The button with the garbage can icon is the delete button, and it's going to allow us to delete images if we want. To review images after shooting, press your playback button. You can scroll through your images using the secondary selector or by swiping with your finger on the monitor. Just below the secondary selector, we have the unlock switch. While I never use this, its purpose is to unlock a custom setting, preventing the secondary selection wheel from changing exposure settings if it is bumped. Next, we have the Q button, and this is going to allow us to select and make changes to our camera settings using our main screen. To the right of the viewfinder, we have the live view video record button. If you are in any regular shooting mode, this button will activate live view, which allows us to preview the shot with our main monitor instead of looking through the viewfinder. If we are in the video shooting mode, this button will start and stop video recording. We'll be talking about live view and live view focusing and video shooting in depth a little later. The teeny little wheel you see on the viewfinder is called the diopter adjuster, which will allow us to change the focus of the glass in the viewfinder. This is very useful for those of us who wear corrective lenses. Near the top right of the camera, where our thumb would rest, we have three little black buttons. The first is the autofocus on button, which can be customized in different ways to help with focus. It is also our primary focus button when we are in live view. The middle button is our exposure lock button, or our flash exposure lock button if we are using a flash. This button allows us to lock our exposure, recompose, and take the picture without the camera remetering the scene. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. The third button is our autofocus point selector, which allows us to activate our autofocus points and then change which focus square we want to use. I have another lesson on the video which will explain this in much greater detail. Below these last two buttons, we have two small magnifying glasses which allow us to zoom in and out of the pictures as we view them. They also help when focusing in live view. If we look at the top of the camera, we see we have 5 buttons and an LCD display. The LCD will show critical shooting information such as our shutter speed, our aperture, our ISO, things of that nature, and we're going to be looking at it quite a bit. The 5 buttons are simple. The smaller one on the far right is the LCD light, because if it's dark outside, hey, we may want to see what we're doing, and we can push this so we can see what the camera settings are. The 4 other buttons help change our camera settings. Going left to right, the first button allows us to change our autofocus type. The second button controls our shooting drive. The third button controls our ISO. And the fourth button is our metering mode. So that's an overview of the camera. We've gone over all the buttons and have briefly covered what they do. I promise that if you practice, the day will come that you will feel you have complete control over your camera, and it feels really good to know how to do everything. Now, there may come a time when you forget which button does what. Just come on back and we'll go over it again. For the rest of the DVD, we'll go through each of these settings individually so you know what they are and what they do. If you found this video helpful, you might be interested in my Canon 80D crash course. I'll show you how to use your camera like a pro and teach you how to take great images even if you're a pure beginner. It can be ordered from the following link.